Okay, folks, I think we're going to get started. Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Tim Zerwinski. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development for the town of Milton. I'm joined by the Assistant Director, Josh Eckhart Lee. We'll be kind of passing back and forth throughout this presentation. This is I actually don't know what number it is, but one of our periodic monthly forums on the MBTA community's zoning requirements. So I see a lot of familiar faces in the attendees list, but there are also some new faces as well. So just to sort of get you situated, first of all, we're recording this meeting. So we are 100% remote via Zoom. We've done a few of these meetings in person. We had wanted to do one in person yesterday. I actually got invited to the warrant committee to speak to them about MBTA communities. I wanted to make sure I took advantage of that invitation. So we rescheduled the meeting to tonight. I anticipate that our next one will be in person, but these meetings are always recorded. You can access them on the Milton Access TV YouTube channel and the town website. And we will be posting a link to the recording on the planning department website as well. So the agenda for tonight, we are in the middle of the introduction. And when we're done with that, we'll give a brief recap of what the MBTA community's zoning requirements actually are. If you've been to one of these forums before, hopefully you're familiar. But if you've never been to one before, we want to make sure that you've got the same information as everybody else. We've got an ongoing survey that we have linked off of our website. Josh will talk a little bit about some of the results that are coming in from that survey. The main portion of the presentation will be an update on technical assistance that we've been receiving in terms of testing scenarios for different zoning districts. We'll do a brief follow-up on any survey results that we have and any public comments that we've gotten that we think merit some extended comments. And then we're going to open it up for a question and comment period. And we'll get to the mechanics of that, towards the end. So we're here on Zoom. Hopefully folks are familiar with how to use the Zoom interface. But if you're not, we are using currently the webinar product. So a webinar is a lot like if we were in a room together. And if you can just imagine Josh and myself sitting at the front and you as attendees of the meeting kind of sitting out in the seats. So when we start the question and comment period, we're going to ask you to use either the raise hand button that should be at the bottom of your screen, or we've also enabled the Q&A feature. So if you've got a question that maybe comes up during the presentation, we're not going to be taking questions during the presentation, but if you want to get into the Q&A so that you don't forget, once the presentation is over, we'll be sort of trading off between questions that are raised in the Q&A and folks that raise their hand to ask a question live. If you're on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, and then you can mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6. And so that's how we're able to see that you've got your hand raised if you're on the phone and you don't have the computer in front of you to press the buttons. So the way this works is if you raise your hand, you will sort of go to the top of a queue of hand raisers. We're going to take folks in the order that they've raised their hands. And like I said, we'll be going back and forth between written Q&A and folks that have raised their hands. These meetings have been a little loose, but we're going to try to give as many folks a chance to speak as possible. So we're going to try to adhere to a 3-minute time limit on comments. And just back of the line, after that, and if you've got more comments or more questions, we'll hopefully be able to get to you. So Josh, I'm going to have Josh talk a little bit about a live poll that we're about to do.
Thanks, Tim. Just trying to make it a little more lively and accessible for folks. We've been running polls at the beginning of each of these meetings. So we're launching one now. You should all see them coming up on your screen. First is one we ask every time, asking whether or not you've been to our forums before. Then we ask if you ride the Mattapan trolley, and if so, how much. And then just for fun, to make sure you know how the buttons are working. We have a very spirited debate, I'm sure, on pancakes versus waffles. So far, waffles are winning out as your answers are trickling in.
So we'll give the poll another 15 or 20 seconds, and then we'll check out the results.
So that looks like just about everybody. The poll's been live for a minute. We have just about 3/4 of you all who have been to a forum before. So I'm glad you're still interested, and that hopefully there's still some new stuff for you all to learn. And welcome to those of you who haven't been here yet. In terms of trolley ridership, we have about 10% of you who ride it daily, about 1/3 who will ride it a couple of times a month, just under half who ride it on rare occasions, and then another 10% who don't ride the trolley. And by a hair, 60% to 40% waffles have won out against pancakes. So we'll keep that in mind when we next feed folks at a morning meeting. Thank you all.
Very, very important results of that poll on waffles. Very interesting. So there it is. Glad to see that we've got a decent amount of fresh faces in the crowd that have never been to one of these forums. So we definitely appreciate you coming. So just before we get started, I mentioned, we'll be posting things on our website. We have a MBTA Communities page on the Planning and Community Development Department website. It's the town just recently got a new website, so things may look a little bit different, but it's the same principle. If you go to departments, go to Planning and Community Development, there's a menu on the left side. The top link is the MBTA Communities page. That has links to all of our past presentations, recordings of all of our past forums, a lot of information and resources directly from the state, a lot of information and resources for various housing agencies throughout the Commonwealth to help you, understand and get a feel for what these new zoning requirements are all about. So, please check in on that page often. It's got a ton of good information, and we're constantly updating it. So to get everyone situated, what is the MBTA Communities Law? So back in January of 2021, the legislature, as part of a massive economic development bill, passed an amendment to Mass General Laws Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act, and they created a new Section 3A of Chapter 40A. And what that does is requires that an MBTA community, which is defined broadly as any community in the Commonwealth that has MBTA service, shall have at least one zoning district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing is permitted as of right, and also meets other criteria set forth in the statute. So your zoning district has to total up to a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre. Can't be more than a half a mile from a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, or bus station, if applicable. This is something that a little bit in a few slides, we'll learn a little bit more about some nuance to that requirement in terms of distance. The zoning bylaw can't have age restrictions. So you can't put into your zoning that only 55 plus or only senior housing is allowed. That doesn't mean that you can't build age restricted housing. You can certainly, if your project is zoning compliant, it can certainly be age restricted. It's just that the zoning itself can't require it at the exclusion of other types of housing. And then finally, the zoning has to allow for housing that's suitable for families with children, which the state housing agency has since interpreted to mean basically you can't put bedroom restrictions. So you can't create zoning that says, yeah, you can build multifamily housing, but you can only build one bedroom apartments. You've got to allow the market to build whatever it wants to build in that regard. The statute lays out a penalty that if you're not compliant with the law, that you're not eligible for certain state grant programs, including MassWorks, the Housing Choice Initiative, and the local capital projects funds. I don't know if we have slides on these programs anymore. Suffice it to say that MassWorks is the big one. It's between $65 and $90 million a year in competitive grants that are used for infrastructure projects in communities throughout the Commonwealth. Milton, in its history, has gotten $1 million in MassWorks grants. If you've ever walked up or down Central Ave between Milton Village and Central Ave, the streetscape improvements in terms of the red bricks and all the nice plantings and everything like that, that was built as a result of a MassWorks grant back in 2012, I believe. So the other ones are a little more obscure, a little bit more, we don't get housing choice money. That's a grant program that's supposed to incentivize housing production. We're not eligible for it. And there's been some recent, work in the fiscal 24 budget that really sort of it takes the local capital projects grant program kind of out of the picture when it comes to MBTA communities. So the State Housing Agency, which is now the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, it used to be DHCD, we'll be calling it HLC from now on. So just if you hear HLC, just think the State Housing Department. The legislation enabled the State Housing Agency to issue guidelines to communities for to help them understand how they could comply with this law. Because when I go back, we don't have the full text of the law here, but it's not that much more detailed than what's on the slide. It's a very short law, and so there's a lot of stuff that you need to interpret and that you need to make assumptions about. And HLC has created guidelines to help communities do that. And so there are a number of variables that we have to satisfy. A zoning district has to be at least 50 acres. That's one element of what they consider to be a district of a reasonable size. So there's a physical size that we need to hit. The other element of what they consider to be a district of reasonable size incorporates what's called zone capacity. And what that means is, the zoning that you create needs to have the potential to allow for X number of housing units. And so what they have said is the zone capacity of Milton's multifamily district needs to be 2,461 units. And then at least 50% of the unit capacity has to be within the transit area. One thing that we took note of very early on when this law came out was that, if you say that you've got a zone within a half a mile of transit, that half-mile radius around Milton's transit stations, a significant portion of that is actually in the city of Boston, which we have no zoning control over. And so, if there's going to have to be a minimum size for a district, we're already behind the 8 ball in terms of the amount of area we have to zone. And so, we made that comment to DHCD when the time was appropriate. A lot of other communities with transit stations that are sort of at or near their borders had a similar issue. And so what the housing agency did was create this guideline that said, in acknowledgement of the fact that you don't have as much space as, say, City of Newton, right, which has the green line goes right through the meat of City of Newton. So every half-mile radius is squarely within, city limits. And so they've got a ton of room, to build these zoning districts. We don't have as much space. And so they've said 50% of your district can be elsewhere in town as long as 50% of it is in that half-mile transit radius. So we've been using state grant funding to procure technical assistance from several planning firms. And what we've been working on is testing options for subdistricts with the state's compliance model, which is a software tool that they have designed and intend to use to basically judge zoning districts to determine if they're compliant or not. It's a model that, basically you input the geography via a geographic information system. You input the zoning parameters that you're going to have in your zoning district: height, density, setbacks, all of that stuff. And that spits out basically the metrics for compliance. So, is it at least 50 acres? Did this community hit their zone capacity numbers? Is at least 50% of the district within the transit area? And if the answer is yes, then great, you've got compliant zoning. And if it's no, you've got to figure out how to get compliant. And so we've had access to this tool, so we know exactly what the state is going to do, if and when we get zoning to them. So we've been using that tool to test different scenarios. So in terms of compliance, there's been a spirited debate in the, almost 3 years that this law has been on the books about, should we comply? Can we not comply? Is it optional? Can we do this? The stance that the department takes is that ultimately town meeting is the venue at which compliance will be decided. The state is requiring us to pass zoning, but it's just like any other zoning article that town meeting is dealt with. There is a public hearing at the planning board. The planning board makes a recommendation. It goes on to the warrant. Town meeting votes on it. And that's how we're going to decide, if we comply or not. So, our job is to help the planning board, help the select board, help the community prepare the best possible version of what compliance looks like based on our knowledge of the town's planning goals, based on the feedback that we get from all of these forums that we have, all of the meetings that we have with the planning board. MBTA communities is a standing item on the planning board agenda every 2 weeks. We talk about it. And just a little kind of snippet of survey results. We put on our survey a question, should the town comply? And almost the supermajority, 63% of survey respondents say that yes, we should comply with state law. Not a scientific poll, but a data point to consider. So in terms of the options for compliance, I mentioned earlier that we have the flexibility to locate part of our district outside of the transit area. And that's based on a calculation of the amount of developable area that we have within a half a mile of transit. As I mentioned, because we're at the border, because we're hugging the Neponset River and the reservation, a significant fraction of that half mile radius is not available for us to zone. And so, we're allowed to zone elsewhere as long as 50% of everything is in that transit area. We don't have to create one district. We can create several sub-districts. And so when we talk about the district, throughout this presentation, what we're kind of talking about is the totality of a number of different sub-districts. And those sub-districts can be different geographies, they can be different sizes, they can have different dimensional parameters. The only requirements are that if you have sub-districts, at least half of the total district has to be in a contiguous sub-district. So the very quick example that I will give is if you are creating a totality of a 50-acre sub-district, you can have one 25-acre sub-district and then five 5-acre sub-districts, because the second requirement is your sub-districts need to be at least 5 acres so that you're not just sort of zoning for individual tiny little parcels all over the place. And so within those constraints, half the district needs to be contiguous, sub-districts need to be at least 5 acres. We've got the flexibility to create different types of sub-districts. So there's a lot of towns out there that already have multifamily zoning by right. And those towns could potentially count that zoned capacity towards their MBTA communities requirements. We do not have any existing compliant districts. We do have a number of multifamily developments, but for a number of reasons, either A, they were permitted via special permit and not by right zoning. Just to be clear, what we mean when we say by right is there's no discretionary approval associated with your permit. So you don't have to go to the planning board for a special permit where they could potentially say no. You don't have to go to the Board of Appeals for a variance. You basically go to the building department, apply for your building permit. We have the ability to subject these projects to site plan review, which is a review that the planning board does for kind of larger, more complex projects. But the planning board doesn't have the discretion to reject a project under site plan review. It's just to sort of review the project and propose conditions that will mitigate, certain physical impacts. So all of the multifamily housing that we have was not permitted by right. And so those districts wouldn't count. Or they're not up to the minimum of 15 units per acre, or there's any of a number of reasons. So we have to create entirely new districts. There's no zoning district that we could count towards these requirements. So we're creating all new zoning. Dimensional requirements are kind of the heart of zoning. Zoning kind of tells you how tall your building can be, how many units can be inside of it, how far it has to be from the property lines, how much of your lot can you cover with a building and impervious surface. We have wide discretion in terms of what those dimensional requirements are, as long as our district overall meets all of the various requirements and thresholds that are laid out in the statute and the guidelines. In fact, there's an overall density requirement of 15 units per acre, but any given subdistrict can have any given density as long as the average of all of the subdistricts comes out to at least 15 units per acre. So the example that I use is if you've got one subdistrict comprising half the total district, that can be 5 units per acre, which is a relatively low density. As long as the other district, which is the other half, has a density of 25 units per acre. And when you put them both together, that adds up to 15 units per acre. And so what we're proposing is a little less straightforward than that, but we're going to be availing ourselves of that ability to have different densities in different subdistricts. So there is a decent amount of flexibility in HLC's guidelines, but there's also a lot of constraints that are inherent in these guidelines and in these requirements, which I think we'll hopefully start to understand a little bit as we go into the presentation. So if at any point HLC determines that an MBTA community is not in compliance with 3A, as I mentioned earlier, that community will not be eligible for funds from these 3 grant programs. HLC has also said that they may in the future take non-compliance into consideration for their other discretionary grant programs. They haven't named any of those programs, but it's their money. They get to decide, how they distribute it, and they may take that into account for other grant awards in the future. So the other, and I just want to make sure, we'll do this slide first, because there are known penalties that are laid out in the statute, the eligibility for those grant programs, and then there are kind of unknown consequences of noncompliance. The law says that you shall have a zoning district. Shall means shall. It doesn't mean may. It doesn't mean we'd really prefer it. It means you shall have it. So you've got to have it. Both Governor Healy and Attorney General Campbell have indicated that this law is a priority for their office. Also, a number of advocacy organizations have said the same thing, and that they intend to hold towns accountable for compliance with MBTA communities. Earlier this month, the town of Holden was subject to a lawsuit by a group called Lawyers for Civil Rights. Lawyers for Civil Rights, very early on in this process, indicated very publicly that they intend to file fair housing lawsuits against towns that don't comply, towns that attempt to use their zoning laws to exclude people and prevent multifamily housing from being built. So that lawsuit was filed earlier this month. We'll see what happens. But the other major thing around noncompliance was this is actually an abridged version of an advisory opinion that the Attorney General issued earlier this year. And I'll read it just so that everyone can hear. And it says, all MBTA communities must comply with the law. Communities that do not currently have a compliant multifamily zoning district must take steps outlined in the DHCD guidelines to demonstrate interim compliance. Communities that fail to comply with the law may be subject to civil enforcement action. Non-compliant MBTA communities are also subject to the administrative consequences of being rendered ineligible to receive certain forms of state funding. Importantly, MBTA communities cannot avoid their obligations under the law by foregoing this funding. The law requires that MBTA communities shall have a compliant zoning district and does not provide any mechanism by which a town or city may opt out of this requirement. MBTA communities that fail to comply with the law's requirements also risk liability under federal and state fair housing laws. The Massachusetts Anti-Discrimination Law and Federal Fair Housing Act prohibit towns and cities from using their zoning power for a discriminatory purpose or with discriminatory effect. An MBTA community may violate these laws if, for example, its zoning restrictions have the effect of unfairly limiting housing opportunities for families with children, individuals who receive housing subsidies, people of color, people with disabilities, or other protected groups. This is as strong a statement as you'll see from an attorney general on her intent to enforce the law. So there has not, the deadline for compliance has not yet passed. That deadline for communities that are considered to be rapid transit communities by the state guidelines, including Milton, is December 31st of 2023. And so, we'll have to see if there are any cities or towns that are non-compliant after that deadline. We're trying to put Milton in a position to be compliant because, again, this is, an exceptionally sternly put advisory from the Attorney General, and, we take it very seriously. So, Josh, do you want to talk a little bit about our survey?
Thanks, Tim. So we originally developed this survey in February of this year. So it's been out for about 6 months, and we've had a ton of responses. We're really grateful. I know a lot of you on this meeting have responded, and I appreciate that. So thank you. You can access the survey if you haven't filled it out at tinyurl.com/Milton MBTA survey. It's also prominently displayed on our MBTA communities webpage. We've tried to make it as accessible as possible. We've put physical flyers out, announced it digitally, put it on our social media, and made the survey available in English, Spanish, French, and simplified Chinese. Just since July, we've had over 100 responses. It says almost here. We've had 4 since I finished writing this portion of the presentation. So we're over 285 responses as of this evening. Really, really wonderful turnout. We're passing those sort of statistically significant thresholds for those statisticians in the crowd. So it's very exciting. And we're really appreciative of those who have been telling their friends about the survey. Word of mouth has been almost as effective in getting the word out as the Milton Times and these public meetings. So please tell your friends and keep telling your friends and tell your neighbors and the people you're not friendly with. We've had some findings from the survey as well. One key finding that we think is really valuable and hopefully reassuring for folks was that we asked if people who own property in the town of Milton would be interested in redeveloping that property were it to be rezoned under MBTA communities. And overwhelmingly, property owners who responded to the survey were not interested in doing so. That doesn't mean those same property owners wouldn't be in favor of this law or that it is an indication that we shouldn't comply with the law, but it is an indication that you won't likely see mass development as a response to this, particularly in areas where there are existing residential developments, housing, particularly in that area closest to the Mattapan trolley. So hopefully that can allay some fears that your neighbors will be changing and creating construction where there hasn't been that previously. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's really important to note about this is that the law is a mandate to create zoning. It's not a mandate for the town to actually build housing. And so when you create new zoning, you give property rights to property owners. And the decision to redevelop and actually avail yourself of that zoning lies with the property owner. We could conceivably pass zoning and not a single new house gets built, and we would still be considered compliant. Now, that's not very likely, but it underscores the principle that once you create the zoning, the decision to redevelop really is now in the hands of property owners. And so, depending on where these zoning districts are, you're talking about potentially hundreds of different property owners making individual decisions about their own property. And so the pace of change, when people hear 2,461 units of capacity, we'll never get 2,461 units out of this zoning for all sorts of reasons. Not least of which, again, is because it's on the schedule of the property owners and when they make decisions to redevelop their property, if they ever do it at all. So it's a very interesting result.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly the finding we found. We also asked about municipal services and benefits that respondents were interested in seeing. And it's been a very tight race at the top between open space, commercial space, and affordable housing as being the ones that have been at that number one spot over various points in time as we've had this survey. While currently open space is receiving the most votes by the respondents we've seen, affordable housing is still the issue that comes up as the most important to the most amount of people. What's really good is that we're also engaged in another planning process with our updated open space and recreation plan. If you go to miltonosrp.com, you can fill out another survey, which will be really helpful in that planning process. So I appreciate all the time you've taken to fill out the survey thus far. And as you keep telling your friends, tell them to also take the open space and recreation plan survey. Thanks so much.
Yeah, one thing to keep in mind about this question is, and I'll kind of try to set up the context for it, is that in a by right zoning scheme, you've got to allow people to build housing if they meet the zoning requirements. The way that we have traditionally done things in Milton is, a property owner wants to rezone their property. And so they try to create new zoning, and they've got to go to town meeting, create new zoning. And, as a result, town meeting will pass zoning that creates a special permit process that lays out all sorts of restrictions and also lays out all sorts of, mitigation measures and community benefits that, the town, hopes to see out of a new development. That's how you get, affordable housing in some of these developments. That's how you get streetscape improvements. That's how you get, contributions to open space. The zoning that comes out of this statute is really sort of a baseline level of you need to allow people to build multifamily. What you can do under this zoning is require at least, or you can require at most 10% of any units in MBTA community zoning to be deed restricted, affordable, SHI eligible units. That's the subsidized housing inventory. That's 40B. So we can require a certain amount of affordable housing. What you can also do is, as long as you have a base of zoning that meets the minimum requirements of MBTA communities, by right, 15 units per acre, et cetera, you can also layer on top of that a special permit process that, in exchange for a height or density bonus, you create a special permit process where you can also, exact some of these community benefits. So, an example would be under the base zoning, you could build a 3-story building with 20 units in it, and developer may do that. But you can also have on top of that a special permit zoning that says we'll let you build 4 stories and 30 units if you provide X percentage of affordable housing, or you contribute to a fund for parks, or you do these streetscape improvements. And so the developer will always have a choice to do the lesser by right scheme or the more generous special permit scheme that also requires certain community benefits. So that's something that we're going to keep in mind as we go through this zoning process. We're still really focused on how to meet those minimum requirements, but in the medium term, how do we want to perhaps allow for even greater density in exchange for some of these community benefits? And so it's something that we're thinking about. We haven't really gotten into a detailed conversation about that, but we continue to ask this question so that we have a good idea of what type of things people are interested in. So there's been a number of updates from our previous forum, and now we're getting into the more experienced participants who hopefully remember what we're talking about. We had been talking about a sub-district on Granite Avenue that, if you remember, included the 2 Granite Avenue property, and then south of that, the State DPW yard, park and ride lot, and the American Legion Hall. And we had created a district that also included a significant portion of DCR land in the form of the salt marshes, to the west of Granite Ave over there. And the purpose of that was to connect to Granite Ave to the State DPW yard, because they're otherwise divided by the highway interchange. And when we ran that through the compliance model, it had some interesting results in terms of the size of the district and how those results kind of interacted with other sub-districts that we were studying. And the results, I'll be honest, were a little fishy to me. And so we reached out to the state and said, look, are we allowed to do this? Is this something that, you're going to, look at and say this is okay? And they basically said, no, don't zone that salt marsh property. It's not in the spirit of the guideline for, you're allowed to zone state land in order to create contiguous districts, and it doesn't count towards your overall land area. But the way we were doing it was not correct. And so, they basically said, you've got to take that out, but we will consider this to be a contiguous district because the only thing separating 2 Granite Ave from the State DPW yard is a highway interchange. And it's a big highway interchange, but it's akin to a street, and 2 parcels across the street from each other would still be considered contiguous. So that has some downstream effects on our kind of overall thresholds, which we'll kind of get into a little bit later. We've also been refining the density of some of these sub-districts. At our last forum, we reviewed a number of sub-districts, both in the transit area and outside of the transit area, that we tested with some very basic preliminary zoning parameters. And, the results were very interesting. Since then, we've been working with the planning board and with our technical assistance providers to start to, dial back or dial up some of those parameters to really modulate the density in some of these sub-districts. The thing that we're trying to accomplish here is, no one sub-district is carrying an inappropriate amount of weight in terms of unit count or density or whatever. We want to make sure we do what's appropriate, given its location in town, given its size. And so we've been working on that, and we've got a little bit of those results coming up. We have off and on been including East Milton in our kind of grouping of sub-districts that we're looking at. The past couple times that we've presented, we have not really talked about East Milton. We've added it back in the mix for a couple reasons, not least of which is East Milton is actually, and we just kicked this off last week, at the very start of its own independent rezoning process. And, the thinking here is that, over the course of the next 12 months, we're going to be talking about, mixed use multifamily zoning in East Milton, not dissimilar to what we did in Milton Village a few years ago. And, since we're going to be rezoning anyway, and we're anticipating that there'll be some level of multifamily housing in the district, let's kind of get credit for that under MBTA communities. And just like I said earlier, where, you can set a very minimum level of, density and dimensional parameters, and then layer on top of that a special permit process. What we may consider doing is creating a very basic multifamily zoning scheme in East Milton under the MBTA communities law. And then when we're finished with the special permit zoning that we've just started working on last week, that'll go on top of that and will be what we think a more attractive option for the development community. And you'll see why in a few minutes. So we're including that in consideration right now, although everything is kind of still up for grabs. We've also started to look at an additional Randolph Avenue subdistrict. We've asked UTIL, which is the planning firm that we're working with for technical assistance, to test another subdistrict. This was a suggestion at the planning board meeting last week. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute about this district, just to see how it affects our overall numbers, if it can be helpful in terms of lightening the load in different other parts of town, or, has a positive effect on our overall density number. We wanted to take a look at that. So just to situate everyone with the sub-districts that we've been talking about, when we talk about the transit area, this is what we're talking about. This is the area in Milton that's within a half a mile of the Mattapan trolley. So you see the sort of scalloped red dotted line at the bottom is sort of the very edge of those half-mile radiuses. And they overlap because the stations are relatively close together. So we've got a portion of Mattapan Station, then Capon Street, Valley Road, Central Ave, and Milton Station. So that's capturing, all of the land in blue. We did an initial test of the compliance model of, what would it look like if we zoned, this for, what is really the minimum level of multifamily housing, which is 3 units in one building. And it yielded some interesting results. What we found in that very first test is that, obviously this area is much greater than 50 acres. And when we zone, under the really basic parameters of 3 or perhaps 4 units on a lot, we get a ton of units, way beyond the zone capacity that's required. But what we don't get is that overall density of 15 units per acre. I think we were topping out at maybe 8 under, what we thought were relatively aggressive, but very basic zoning parameters. And so after that initial test, we realized we need to look at other parcels where we can have greater density to kind of pump up that overall density number. Because as you'll recall, what we said earlier, you can have a low density district as long as there's another high density district that's offsetting that and getting you to 15 units per acre. And so, over the course of our work with our technical assistance provider, we started to look at, and you can kind of just see the difference between these two. The area that is now kind of ghosted out of the greater, wider transit area are parcels that were either too small. And what happens when you've got small parcels is if you set a minimum lot size and you've got a parcel that's below that, you don't get zoned capacity credit for that. It's an unbuildable lot, 0 units, but it's taking up land area. So basically you've got a bigger denominator and a smaller numerator in that math equation that gets you to your overall density dwelling units per acre. On the other end of the spectrum is if you set a relatively low number of units per parcel, it's 3 or 4 in our original calculations. If you've got some of these big parcels near 6 and 7, you've got multiple acres of land that are only netting you 4 units of zone capacity. So again, you've got a really big denominator in terms of the land area and a relatively scrawny numerator because you're only getting 4 units. And so we've kind of taken the areas that have some of the biggest parcels and some of the smallest parcels and kind of carved them out of the zoning district, and then created these smaller little sub areas based on parcel size and kind of street configuration. There's not much of a science to this except just trying to follow the streets and follow the sort of the patterns of the lot sizes. So we've got these 7 smaller sub districts. So keep this map in mind as we continue to talk. I mentioned earlier that we need to look at some other larger parcels, perhaps outside of the transit area, where we can kind of crank up that density a little bit more to make up for the fact that the transit area itself is going to be a relatively low density district. And so we're looking at, I mentioned this Granite Ave district in the upper right, which, in this diagram includes that salt marsh area. That salt marsh area is out. We also, did some additional work on the dimensional requirements of some of the larger parcels in the Milton Village and Central Ave area. We did some, we created a district around Unquity House on Curtis Road. And then we looked at the existing multifamily housing at Fuller Village, and then also the Brush Hill Rehabilitation Center between Brush Hill Road and the Ponza Valley Parkway, and then also the A. Thomas and Sons landscape business property, and then also the Animal Rescue League land behind that as a relatively large parcel on Randolph Ave. Our thinking behind selecting these areas, because if you're creating sub-districts, you can draw a 5-acre line around any part of town and say, we're going to rezone this. Some of the principles that we put behind this were, large parcels that would be appropriate for, actual multifamily development, non-residential or commercial parcels. So, trying to limit the impact on existing single-family neighborhoods. So some of these parcels are obviously adjacent to single-family neighborhoods, but they're not within, in the same way that, if you were to rezone the entire transit area, you'd be, deep in the heart of a single-family neighborhood. And, we tried to spread them around town. There's a principle of fairness that people have talked about where, if you consider multifamily housing to have certain impacts on traffic, quality of life, infrastructure, whatever, you want to see that kind of spread around so that not one single part of town is being, unduly affected. And so that's kind of the thinking behind some of these districts that we've been testing. I mentioned that new Randolph Ave subdistrict that we wanted to test as well. And this is, if you're familiar, this is just south of the DPW yard, right adjacent to Granite Links off of the Dump Access Road. And so this subdistrict includes 728 Randolph Ave, which is the recently approved 40B, 40 units on 1.6 acres. And then also the horse farm property that back in 2012 was rezoned for assisted living residential development. The thinking here was that, okay, it's a 40B, but there's going to be some existing multifamily housing here. Let's try to fold that in and see if we can sort of, get credit for those units in a fashion. And then, also, while assisted living is different from a market rate, apartment building, the town went through a process to rezone this area for a relatively intensive style of development, relative to single family houses. And so what we've done is, we're going to be testing some initial zoning parameters of 25 units per acre, which is the density of the 40B project, and a little bit more than the density of the what would have been, the assisted living project that happened as a result of that zoning. 1.5 acre minimum lot size, and then a 3.5 story height limit. We're going to see what that yields in terms of helping us with our overall density figure, in terms of helping us with, maybe it would allow us to relieve some of the density on one of the other sub districts, because, what you're going to see in a slide or two is some of these districts have to have a pretty significant number of units in them in order for us to hit our targets. And so, we wanted to find appropriate sub-districts that maybe could alleviate some of that pressure. So I mentioned that we've been sort of adjusting the density and some of the parameters around some of these districts that we've tested. If you were here for our last forum, you may remember that when we tested that Brush Hill Road sub-district where Fuller Village currently is, even if we set it at, what are relatively modest for multifamily standpoint, density of, 20 units per acre on a, 60 some odd acre site, that was yielding upwards of 1,300 units in unit capacity, which is way too much, just way, way too much. And so, we've had to kind of try to figure out ways to reduce that number. And the way that we've been able to do it is basically just reducing the number of units per acre in the compliance model, down to, I think, 10. And that gets you to 663, potential units in that sub-district of 60 plus acres. Still a lot of units. It is a lot of units. So what we're presenting here is, based on the information that we have now and based on some of the adjustments that we've made, we cranked up the density a little bit on Curtis Road. We cranked it down on Brush Hill Road. We made some adjustments to the transit area, and just recall, transit area 1 through 5 is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up here. Transit area 6 and 7 are these purple ones. And then when we say Elliott, that's actually just the Milton Village parcels up here, just to situate everybody. So this chart, shows all of the sub-districts that we've been testing. So you've got the name, you've got the unit capacity under what we think are appropriate density levels and zoning parameters. The column where it says density denominator, this is the figure that's your denominator when you're coming up with your dwelling units per acre. And what this density denominator does is it takes out all of the excluded land. So, if we zone somewhere and there's a piece of state land, within the zoning district, that's excluded. That, is part of the overall acreage of the district, but when you're measuring dwelling units per acre, that gets excluded. The land that makes up the roads gets excluded. That doesn't count towards, your sort of overall density calculation. It will count towards the overall acreage of the district. This DU per AC is dwelling units per acre, so that's your density. And that's just a simple math problem. 701 divided by 12.4 gets you 56.53. So as you can see from this, our unit capacity requirement is 2,461. So if we were to create a zoning district that included all of these sub-districts, we would be way above that with 3,183 unit capacity. So that's good. Dwelling units per acre, 9.06. That's below the 15 units per acre requirement. The district acreage, 362 acres, way above the minimum requirement of what do you call it? Of 50 acres. So the other thing though that you have to sort of again keep in mind is that half of the density that we create, so half of all of the unit capacity needs to be in the transit area. And under this scheme, 214 is in the transit area in 6 and 7, plus 406. Elliott and Curtis are also in the transit area. And there are 171 units in the Granite Ave district that are in the transit area. That does not add up to half. So even though we are kind of, well, no, in this, and I'm sorry, in this scenario, that might add up to half. I'm a little bit mixed up because I'm going to go to the next one. And here's where we encounter this problem. So in this scenario where we just do everything, we're not at the overall density that we need to be. If we take out those transit area parcels, so we're taking out transit area 1 through 5, transit area 6 through 7, we're keeping East Milton, we're keeping the other large parcels. The density that we've set for East Milton, I just want folks to know, is less than 1/3 of the recently approved 440 Granite Avenue project. That project sits on approximately a half an acre and is 24 units. So, that is a project that went through a planning board process for site plan review, went through a variance process that is a 48 unit per acre project. That project itself is itself half the density of the 40B project, the residence at East Milton, which is approximately 92 units on a 1 acre site. So now obviously that is a big project and it's a 40B and we don't want to use it as a precedent, but I just want to show people that when we talk about creating MBTA community zoning in East Milton, what we're talking about is a density that is far below recently approved projects. And if I'm making a prediction, will be below whatever the density that we come up with the East Milton zoning process. I'll give you a good way to think about it if you're familiar with this 440 Granite Avenue project, which is 4 stories, 24 units on a half an acre. At this density level, 15 units per acre, what you would have on that site is perhaps 8 units. And maybe you're talking about a 2-story building, if not a 1-story building, to fit those units on that site. So, we're including East Milton, we're testing East Milton at a really low density, and quite frankly, at a density that is probably too low to achieve the goals of our zoning process that we're engaged in over there. So if you look at these numbers, unit capacity is 2563. So still above, we were way above on the last one. We're a bit closer to the target of 2461. We're good on dwelling units per acre. We're at 19.62. That's, above the 15 per acre requirement. District acreage, again, way above the 50 acre minimum. What we don't have here is a sub-district that represents half of the total area of the district. So, if you just look, the total area of everything is 139.6. Let's round up to 140. The largest individual sub-district we have is Brush Hill Road at 66.2, which is not quite half of 140. So if we wanted to use these sub-districts, you'd have to probably increase the size of the Brush Hill subdistrict slightly in some way. But the more significant problem is because we took out transit area 1 through 5 and transit area 6 through 7, we no longer have half of our unit capacity within a half a mile of transit, which means that even if we did get Brush Hill Road to be a little bit bigger to represent a contiguous 50%, we still wouldn't have that final requirement of half of your unit capacity is in the transit area. So finally, just to kind of test the original large parcels, that we tested. We don't want to do that new Randolph Ave parcel. We don't want to do East Milton. We just want to do the districts that we've been testing already. You're a little bit low on unit capacity. You could potentially make that up if you made a few upward adjustments on each of these. We're still way above on overall density at 20.66 units per acre. We have a sub-district that represents 50% contiguous sub-district. Brush Hill Road, 66 acres is more than half of 116. But again, we're a little short on unit capacity, and we're way short on 50% of unit capacity in the transit area. And I keep on repeating that because the implications are, remember the requirements that we need to hit. Overall density of 15 dwelling units per acre. Overall district size of at least 50 acres. overall unit capacity of at least 2,461 units. At least half of that needs to be within a half a mile of transit, and at least one sub-district representing 50% of the overall area of the entire zoning district has to be in one contiguous district. Getting half of our unit capacity within a half a mile of transit is going to be nearly impossible without zoning some portion of the transit area. So again, just to situate everybody, when we talk about the transit area, we're talking about this. Transit areas 1 through 5, transit area 7 and 6. This was the zoning that, this was the scenario that included those areas at zoning parameters that yielded 406 units in 1 through 5 and 214 in 6 through 7. And what's behind this is in 1 through 5, a 7,500 square foot minimum lot size, with a sort of sliding scale upward where you can get an additional unit for every 2,500 square feet of lot size that you have, up to 6 units. And then transit area 6 through 7, similar scheme, 10,000 square foot minimum lot size, an additional unit for every 5,000 square feet of lot size that you have, up to 6 units. Which we thought, based on some feedback that we've gotten, was a little bit more appropriate, perhaps, to give some of these projects a little bit space to breathe, allow for a little bit more open space, a little bit more circulation. What winds up happening when you set the minimum lot size at 7,500 square feet is there are many, 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 many parcels in transit area 1 through 5 that are less than 7,500 square feet. And so those remain in your district acreage number, but they're not yielding you any units in unit capacity, because if you have a parcel that's below 7,500 square feet, it's not compliant. You can't build anything on it. 0 units plus, whatever the area is. And so, when we do what we think is, an appropriate level of density, we're not getting a ton of unit capacity, and we're getting dinged on the overall acreage. And so there's no way of not zoning the transit area unless you really, really crank up the density on these parcels. So there's currently 171 units in the transit area on Granite Ave. You would have to up that significantly. You'd have to up the Milton Village parcels. You'd have to up the Curtis Road parcels to get to, 1,300 units in the transit area, which it's a tough row to hoe with only those 3 relatively small sub-districts. So what we're starting to realize, and we're going to work with our technical assistance providers about this, is some combination of the following tactics are going to be necessary to get to 2,461 of unit capacity, 15 units per acre, half the unit capacity in the transit area, contiguous district, of 50% of the total size of the district. So maybe one of these tactics, maybe all of them, maybe some combination of them, but reducing the overall size of the transit area will, reduce the district acreage, reduce that denominator, and hopefully get you, a good increase in overall density. It's kind of, it's a little bit of an open question as to, which of these you maybe would eliminate. One thing to keep in mind is that, we've got the Curtis Road property here. We've got the Milton Village properties over here. You could create that contiguous 50% sub-district by connecting them, which is an argument for keeping 2, 3, 4, and 5. But there may be other considerations that we may want to consider. 6 and 7 are also, again, because of the size of those parcels, are really creating a drag on the overall density. And so, one one planning principle that you may kind of impose on this is, 1 through 5 or 2, 3, 4, and 5 are closest to transit. They're in the district, and the ones that are more further afield are out. But really what we're trying to do is figure out how to get to that overall density figure. We'll need to adjust the dimensional parameters in the transit area. The 7,500 square foot minimum lot size is excluding entirely too many parcels and cranking up that district acreage to a degree that is not offset by the number of units that are being created in unit capacity. That may mean a return to a lower 5,000 square foot minimum lot size. Maybe it's another minimum lot size in combination with other changes. The Brush Hill Road subdistrict, because if you recall, the way that we had laid it out the first time was yielding way too many units. And so we need to reduce the overall density of that subdistrict to get it to a manageable level of units. The consequence of that is, even though it's yielding 663 units in unit capacity, which is a ton of units, because it's such a big subdistrict, the density is not even 11 units per acre, which itself is below the 15 dwelling units per acre that we need to hit overall, and is really representing a drag on the rest of the subdistricts in terms of overall density. And then, in almost every case, there'll probably have to be an adjustment to the unit capacity in some of these other districts. And I think, the hope is that the combination of strategies that we try to deploy here doesn't require cranking up the unit capacity on any of these other subdistricts to a degree that would be intolerable. So in terms of next steps, we're continuing to work with our planning consultant, UTIL is the name of the firm, to develop a final set of subdistrict options for consideration. And we're going to try to be in front of the planning board and the select board next week with, what we hope are a set of feasible, reasonable subdistricts that will help us achieve compliance so that we can start to winnow away some of the ones that aren't doing it for us and start to think about, okay, we're going to settle on some districts and, get to work, writing some of this zoning. We've commissioned a fiscal impact analysis. Consultant RKG Associates has been working on that. They're going to make an appearance at next week's planning board meeting on August 24th to talk a little bit about their methodology, talk a little bit about, if they have any findings yet, and give the planning board an opportunity to ask some questions and give them some clarity on some of the issues that the board is interested in. This fiscal impact analysis is meant to help us ascertain what are the impacts going to be on services like police and fire, on infrastructure, on, any burden on the school system. And then on the other end of the spectrum, what are the tax revenue implications of, this new zoning that we're being required to develop. We're also working with town council and are in the process of seeking outside consultant assistance to use the state's model bylaw. The state has a model bylaw that they created. They've made it available to cities and towns. The thinking, being there, if you do your compliance modeling activities and are able to plug in districts and dimensional parameters, you can sort of, it's not as easy as just plug and play, but you're not creating zoning from scratch. You're using this model, to kind of hang your individual requirements on it. So we're going to be using that as the basis for zoning language. The planning board is going to be sending out a mailing to every house in Milton. They just approved a flyer that's going to go in the water bill. That's a staggered delivery over the course of 3 months. A third of the town, gets their water bill in any given month. So, the thinking being that, we're doing the best we can to publicize, these forums, and we're trying to get write-ups in the Milton Times, and we're going on town social media. We wrote a letter to all the town meeting members that got delivered maybe a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. But, everybody opens up their water bill, and hopefully they'll get some information on MBTA communities and kind of get clued into, what we're doing here. And then just as always, MBTA Communities is the subject of these monthly public forums and is a standing item on the planning board agenda every 2 weeks, the second and fourth Thursday of the month. We don't have a date set yet for our next public forum. I think we're going to try to navigate a little bit around back to school and try to find the best date and the best venue for that. But it'll be approximately a month from today, give or take a couple days. So just keep an eye out for that. But we'll be at the planning board and the select board in the meantime. So we're going to open up the question and comment period. Just as a reminder, I see there's been a number of questions in the Q&A. We also have the raise hand button. So if you want to ask a question in real time, press that button. If you're on the phone and not on the computer, you raise your hand by pressing *9, and then you can mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6. So, Josh, do you want to be the MC of this?
Sure thing, Tim. I can read out the questions we've received, and folks can also.
Can you answer one question for me right now?
Absolutely.
Can you see the question and answers when I share screen?
No.
Or are you just seeing the slideshow? Okay, good. All right, go ahead.
So Jill Clark asked the first Q&A question. She says, I find it distressing that around 40% of survey respondents think that we should not comply with the law. Do you have a sense of the sentiment about complying with the law among town meeting members?
I do not have a sense of compliance among town meeting members, unfortunately. We sent out a mailing to town meeting members. We want to make sure that they especially are, paying attention to this process, and it's not going to be something that comes out of left field for them when we get to, town meeting and they get a warrant in the mail. But I don't have any indication, what percentage of town meeting members think about the issue. So unfortunately, not a great answer for that question.
We then have a question from an anonymous attendee asking why we're showing options that don't present compliance, as we did on slide 27. It seemed confusing to them, and they just want to see options that work.
Well, so I definitely appreciate that, and we're not interested in confusing anybody. I think the answer to that question is we don't have an option that works yet. What we have is a bundle of potential options that that we need to settle on. So we've identified different geographies in town that we think would be appropriate for multifamily development. And the next step is figuring out how to make them work together. So, we don't have, there is no, right now with the information that we have, there is no option that works. But we're close, I think. I think we've identified a pathway to getting to, the answer of 2,461 units with an overall density of 15 units per acre, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I've got slide number 27 up, which yes, it doesn't work. I wanted to help walk people through the process of how we're trying to figure this stuff out. But the solution to the problem includes some combination of these subdistricts at a relatively sort of same level of kind of statistics and kind of density and unit capacity and acreage here. So we're still settling on the right answer is really what it comes down to. Josh, we have a hand raised among the participants.
Yep, Ralph Parent, you can unmute yourself and present.
Tim, thank you very much. And this is a great presentation. I'd like to state up front that I'm in full support of the MBTA communities, and I encourage decision makers in the town to embrace the opportunity that the state is offering. The penalties for non-compliance are minimal. And in my opinion, they're not really penalties. It's actually bait. The state is building a case against cities and towns that do not comply, and I'm concerned about round 2 and 3 of penalties that may come in the future. I'm a real estate developer by profession. Me speaking tonight is to provide insight into the conversation I'm having with fellow real estate developers. It's no surprise to me when I moved to the town 3 years ago to learn of the many 40B projects that were in queue. Simply, developers use the state law to their advantage because the town's inaction to allow for affordable housing. I offer a couple of scenarios, and one is, what if we're one of the few towns or cities that's on rapid transit that does not comply, while other surrounding towns have complied? We leave ourselves out there for exposure, and it's my opinion that the state's going to make examples of the cities and towns that do not comply. Now, the other side is, living in the town, and I have a reputation in the town, a legacy that I'd like to keep positive, but I can't speak for other developers who do not live in Milton and see the opportunity to line their pockets. And I'll give you an example. Other real estate developers that I'm in conversations with, whether it's Brookline, Newton, Wellesley, Needham, Milton, of course, they would purchase a parcel of property within the half-mile radius of rapid transit, file for building permit for multifamily, wait for the town to deny, then take that denial straight to the AG's office and demand that they enforce the state law. Lastly, they would call the press and call all of the housing advocates to make sure that the AG upholds the law. So this is an opportunity that I would hope the town takes serious enough that we are in control right now to pick our locations, set the guidelines, because once developers come in with their creative ideas, we will lose control. So again, I encourage the town decision makers to embrace this opportunity that we have to not drop the ball, and make it the best possible opportunity for the town of Milton. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for those comments, Ralph. Appreciate it. We have another question in the Q&A from Jill Clark. She writes, you may indirectly answer this when you were talking about East Milton, but does the zoning have to be strictly residential? Or could it be mixed use zoning so that we would add housing capacity as well as any new tax revenue? It's a good question. There's a lot going on with this stuff. And so I oftentimes need to remind myself that there's some things that people don't know. And one of them is that the guidelines as they are currently written prohibit us from mandating mixed use. So we cannot create a district that says you need to have ground floor commercial. And the reason that the state did that was to, there are plenty of areas that we're looking at right now, East Milton, Central Ave, Milton Village, where there's already existing, commercial, and you can probably safely bet that a developer would want to do a mixed use project. But say we were down on Brush Hill Road, or say there's another town, out in the middle of the woods somewhere, and they create zoning that says, yeah, you've got to have mixed use if you want to develop, this parcel in the hinterlands of Ashby or wherever. No disrespect to Ashby. It's just the one that came to mind. If there's no market for commercial space, then what you've effectively done by requiring it is prohibited development. And so the state is trying to sort of preclude towns from pulling, a little dirty trick by saying you can't require it. Now you can allow it. You can absolutely allow it. So, any zoning that we do in Milton Village is going to allow, mixed use. And, I mentioned earlier that you can do these sort of tiered processes of having, a by right scheme, that, has a minimum level of density, and then a special permit scheme on top of that, offers a density bonus that would be attractive to developers. And then you can sort of attach some strings to that. And one of those strings could be, if you want to get the greater density and the greater height, you have to do mixed use. And that's the sort of the mechanism by which a lot of towns are navigating this. Now, I have heard through third and fourth hand sources that, town of Brookline has been kind of at the forefront of this conversation, although there have been a lot of towns that are involved with it, they're very concerned about, they'd like to rezone the Harvard Street corridor, between Coolidge Corner and Brookline Village, which is a really appropriate place for multifamily housing. It's really good planning, but it's also the heart of their commercial zone, and they don't want to put that commercial property at risk. And they have been lobbying super hard at the state level for a change in the guidelines that would allow them to require mixed use. So, there may or may not be some movement on that, but in the meantime, my suspicion is that we will allow mixed use where it's appropriate, and then, talk about creating perhaps a special permit process that actually incentivizes it. Next in the Q&A, we have Kathleen O'Donnell writes, why are we spending all this effort to move density out of the transit area when one of the major purposes behind the law is to get people closer to transit and out of their cars? It's a good question, Kathleen. Thank you for asking it. We're weighing a lot of different considerations here. Obviously, it is a transit-oriented development law. That's why it's a half is a half mile within transit. That's why they asked for that. But there's also the fact that, again, a significant portion of that radius is not available to us to zone. And so if we were, still required to remain within the transit area, then the density required within that area would be even greater than, what we were actually, required to do. There's another conversation, and this is frankly, a self-imposed restriction. But we've got a lot of comments about, spreading the stuff around so that no one single neighborhood, bears an unacceptable burden of new multifamily housing and the impacts that come with that. That's something we've wanted to test what that looks like. There are ways in which it works. There are ways in which, you've seen, that it doesn't work, and we'll have to sort of figure that out. You see that, the requirement that half of your zone capacity needs to be in the transit area starts to lead you back towards that original kind of, this is transit oriented, you can't get around it, you've got to sort of zone around transit. So I think it's, I don't want to say it's still an open question, but I mean, everything, I guess, is still an open question until we get, zoning written. But, if folks are interested, and this can happen at the planning board level, or it can happen elsewhere, folks are interested in really kind of focusing on the transit area, we can do that. But I think what we've been hearing is, a sentiment and a desire to kind of spread this around town a little bit more. Next in the Q&A, Pete Jackson asks, what is the total number of existing units in sub-districts 1 through 7? Josh, do you have, I've been texting with Josh about this question to make sure we had a good answer. Do you have some data on that?
Yeah, Tim, and I'm showing a tool now that is available as one of the resources on our MBTA communities page. The tool called Residensity, which is managed by the Mass Housing Partnership. And it's an interactive mapping tool where you can look at the existing density in certain areas. And when you plug in what those districts 1 through 7 are, which is the area that Pete has asked about, you see we have an existing approximate 1,300 units at about 5 units per acre. So when we think about starting from scratch, we're not necessarily thinking of those existing units. The zoning has to be essentially treating them as if they are not that existing density.
And just to make sure we cover all of our bases, this tool kind of measures where we're at right now with sort of 1 through 7, but it's a little bit closer to like 1,800 units in the entire half-mile radius, because you may remember portions of that half-mile radius were kind of lopped off for kind of lot size reasons. So so that's that. This res density tool, we link to it off of our website. It's really awesome, for these purposes, but you can use it for all your kind of map nerd, pursuits. I recommend you guys, you all check it out. Another question in the Q&A from Pete Jackson. He writes, if a total of 1,232 units need to be in the transit district, 50% of the total required, don't we have to add capacity to get that unit up to 1,232 regardless of lot size? Yes, that's true. The way that there's a number of ways to sort of get to that number, and I'm gonna share my screen one more time just so I have these numbers up. Give me just half a second. We'll do this one. Josh, can you see that window?
I can, yes.
So where we are right now, goodness gracious, sorry. We've kind of, in our latest test of the model, we've adjusted the dimensional parameters in transit area 1 through 5. I mentioned this earlier, to have a 7,500 square foot minimum lot size, with a sort of increasing increment of density for every 2,500 square feet of lot that you have, you could get an extra unit. So at 7,500, you get 3. At 10,000, you get 4, et cetera, up to 6 units. And similarly, in transit area 6 through 7, you start with the 10,000 square foot minimum lot size, and then for every 5,000 square feet of lot size that you have, you can get an extra unit up to 6 units. And what that yields you in unit capacity is 406 units in transit area 1 through 5, and 214 in transit area 6 through 7. Which, if you think that that's an appropriate density level and an appropriate minimum lot size, then 406 and 214 are where you're at. In order to get to that, so this is in this scenario, and Josh, can you whip out the calculator real quick and see if we're at those numbers right now, with these. So 171 in Granite Ave, 385 on Elliott Street, 198 at Curtis, 406 in 1 through 5, 214 and 6 through 7. Does that get to half?
That gets us to just at 1,374, so just over half.
Right. So in this scenario, what you would then need to do, because the totality of these does not get us to 15 units per acre. So if you wanted to use those densities, you would need to crank up the density elsewhere on either Granite Ave or Elliott Street or Curtis Road or Randolph Ave or Brush Hill Road or East Milton, to get us to 15 units per acre. Now, we are already way over on unit capacity at 3,183. So if you crank up the unit capacity even further elsewhere to bring up that overall dwelling units per acre, now we're getting more and more and more and more and more over our unit capacity number, which may be okay. I suspect that it's not, though. I think a lot of people are concerned about 2,461 being a very high number. And so the idea of chasing an overall density by increasing our overall unit capacity, I don't think is a really good idea. And so in order to get to that overall density of 15 units per acre and not also way overshoot our unit capacity number and also way densify all of the other sub-districts, you need to increase the capacity in transit area 1 through 5 and potentially transit area 6 and 7. And you do that through a number of ways. You could do it through, really the most effective way is minimum lot size, because you could say, let's increase the scale to, you get more than 6 units, in that increment. You don't cap it. I mean, the problem is in transit area 1 through 5, there's not a lot of parcels that are much more than, 15,000 square feet, if there are any. So that number doesn't really do you much. In order to actually up the unit capacity in the transit area, you need to be lowering that minimum lot size and bringing more lots into the fold that can generate unit capacity, which is, we've gotten down to, you could go even lower. You could go to 4,000 or 3,000, square feet, but we think that's way too small. 5,000 is really as small as we, would feel comfortable getting. But there's also a number of other kind of adjustments to those calculations that you would also need to make, in order to get to that. We've got another question from Donna Dickerson in the Q&A. I still do not understand why a large swath of area within half a mile of transit stations is treated as untouchable. Why not include some or all of that area rather than reverting to a formula based on less than 7,500 square feet in transit areas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7? It's a good question, Donna. Thank you for asking it. There's a couple of reasons here. And let me just go back to the map that shows, sorry for giving everybody a headache with that. So 6 and 7 are larger parcels. And they are also, significant portions of those are in the National Register Historic District. We've talked about this in previous meetings. The maintaining the physical character of the town is really important. Every planning effort that we've ever done has told us this. Now, that means for everybody. There are a lot of different neighborhoods in Milton that lend, that physical character to what makes Milton unique. And, Valley Road is its own thing. And, Morton Street is its own thing. And, Russell Street is its own thing. And Capon Street's its own thing. But from a calculation standpoint, when we're in this model, working with the sub-districts that we have and working with the numbers that it's generating, keeping 6 and 7, even if you increase the density of 6 and 7 to a greater level, really it's still not getting you to that overall density figure that you need because the parcels are so big. So I mean, we're giving consideration to the small parcels in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, really by saying we're capping this at 3 units per parcel, because these parcels are too small for 4, 5, or 6 units. That same type of consideration goes in 6 and 7, where, even if you allowed 6 units on a parcel, you're still, because, and you can kind of see this from this map, I wouldn't be able to count all of the parcels in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could probably count, just with your eyes right now, the number of parcels in 6 and 7. There's not actually a lot of parcels. And so cranking up the density is still not getting you the bang for the buck that you need. And then when you weigh that against all of the other kind of, considerations of, again, National Historic District, the potential for teardowns is much greater the more units you allow on a given lot. So again, on a small lot, there's still a better than even chance, I believe, that we can write zoning that encourages people to renovate and provide additions on existing housing rather than tearing housing down. Once you start to get above 4, 5 units, there's no way that you're going to fit that, in some of these houses. And you start to put houses at risk for tear down. And so we're trying to give the same consideration to each of these sub-districts. I mean, we could crank up the density in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, correspondingly, to get to a density and a figure that we need. But we don't want to do that. And the same goes in 6 and 7. So, we'll continue to test this. We'll continue to find a way that, keeps as many of these districts intact as we can. But the fact of the matter is that dropping certain districts does more for us than keeping them and trying to make them work in a way that we think is fair and equitable.
We have Mark with a hand raised.
Oh, we got a hand. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Mark Christo calling, Waldo Road. And just listening to the commentary, a couple of valid points. One about questioning whether or not we shouldn't be building on larger size lots over 7,500, and also about development outside of the transit area. I'd like to bring the conversation back to the fact that the Mattapan trolley is not rapid transit. As I've said before, it's really distinctly dissimilar because it's operationally inferior to rapid transit. As we know, it's a single vessel, it's short distance, it has many close stops, and it serves as a feeder just like a bus, and we've got many bus routes in Milton, and it only takes you as far as the Ashmont terminus. And being a terminus and we being outside of it, it doesn't allow for direct linear transport into downtown. So, I see these critical differences, and I think that when you get to Ashmont, at that point in time, you need to transfer. It's required to transfer. And at that point, you lose your priority. So the trolley itself, with its limited carrying capacity, and the fact that it only gets you as far as Ashmont, makes me think we really are not a rapid transit community. And when I look at the numerics too, I think, and I was trying to count seats on the trolley a couple of weeks ago, there's about 38 or 39. When I hopped on the rapid transit train at Ashmont, of which there are 6 contiguous trains, there's about 65 seats on each one of them. So 65 times 6 is 390 versus 38. That's a tenfold difference. And then when I look at the numerics too about how many people are riding and utilizing our transit stops, they're negligible by comparison. We've got only dozens in my neighborhood, Valley and Cape, and then few hundred in Milton and Central, and you've got thousands at other stops. So the carrying capacity is at a deficit. I don't think it would be able to support that amount of development, and it's much different from all rapid transit lines elsewhere. When I look at rapid transit, I was trying to think of a nice little equation maybe to utilize. So when I think of rapid transit, say on the orange, any of the red lines, whether it be Ashmont, Prainter, Alewife, the blue line or the green line, I see an equation that has just 2 variables, the wait time at the local stop and then the trip that takes you to downtown Boston. When we utilize the Mattapan trolley as Milton residents to get downtown, we're not using a 2-variable formula. We're using a 6-variable formula. You've got a wait time at your local stop. For me, it's at Valley. You get the trip to Ashmont, then the mandatory required transfer, at which point, by the way, you lose your priority as a passenger. You don't automatically get a seat on the train, but then you get the wait time at Ashmont, and you get dwell time wait, the time that it takes for that train to be sequenced before it's released. And then finally, you get the trip to Boston. So you get a 6-variable formula for us, 2 for everybody else. No ability to get downtown and carrying capacity issues. I think we really need to pursue the reclassification to get this right. It's going to help support your efforts to try to develop housing that doesn't overwhelm neighborhoods and doesn't pit one neighborhood against the other. Because to base an aggressive housing agenda upon a faulty premise, which is that misclassification, to me, it's wrong, and it's going to be very difficult to seek compliance. So I think we really need to focus on those matters, bring those things to the table, and be persistent with it. And I think that's going to help us, quite frankly. So that's my point for tonight. I'm hoping that, for those people that are new, maybe listening to that will help them to formulate, the most appropriate response to this big dilemma that we're dealing with. But thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Christo. So just a couple of quick points, for folks that have not been following this as closely as others. This has been an issue that the planning board and the select board have been kind of batting around for the past few weeks. The select board just last week voted to send a letter to the MBTA board of directors, raising a lot of the issues that Mr. Christo just raised, and seeking some additional specific information on how the MBTA classifies the Mattapan trolley as rapid transit. It's relevant because the classification of the level of service that a community gets via the MBTA dictates its obligations under MBTA communities. So if you're a rapid transit community, the thinking there is you've got the most frequent kind of best level of service. You're closest to the inner core. You have the highest obligations and the highest responsibilities for new housing under MBTA communities. Commuter rail communities come next. And then there are adjacent communities, which are communities that don't have an MBTA station, but have developable area within a half-mile radius, within their town limits. So ultimately, it's HLC, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, that created the guidelines that said, rapid transit communities have these obligations. They have told us that they defer to the T when it comes to how they define and classify their service. And so that's why we're now trying to talk to the T and figure out, the best argument, if there's an argument to be made to HLC around, whether or not Milton should be considered a rapid transit community. I have not heard anything in my conversations with officials at the T that would lead me to believe that, what they've basically said is, we've got a service policy that defines these things based on infrastructure and headways. If it's not a train, then what is it? But I think, what we're trying to find out from the T is what are these specific kind of characterizations and different criteria that they use so that we can start to kind of compare that with, our understanding of the reality of the situation, which is that, the cars are not really that good and the stations are in bad condition and there's been a lack of investment over decades, which, whatever side of the issue you're on, I think we can all agree that the Mattapan trolley needs to be better. So thank you for those comments, Mr. Christo. We have a anonymous attendee in the Q&A who is asking who owns the land in the proposed Brush Hill district. It appears to be largely undeveloped land that presumably can be acquired at a lower cost than some other proposed districts. The Brush Hill district is currently composed of two large parcels that are owned by the Fuller Housing Corporation. Fuller Village is on those parcels right now. That's existing multifamily housing for seniors. There's 300 some odd units over their campus. And then the northernmost parcel in that sub-district is the Brush Hill Rehabilitation Center, which is a, inpatient, or I forget if it's inpatient or outpatient. It's a rehab center, former seminary. So there is, a residential history to that building. But those properties are developed. They're owned by, operators of their respective, uses, whether it's senior housing or the rehab facility. So redevelopment of those properties is probably a much longer term prospect. Could be decades from now, Fuller Village decides that they want to redevelop and build some newer, better housing. They'll have the zoning to do it. But those are both going concerns right now. So they're not undeveloped, although Fuller Village is very specifically planned to include a lot of conservation land and open space, which is it's probably a feather in the planning board's cap that people think that it's undeveloped. I think that's what they were going for when they site plan that property. Another question in the Q&A, how are home businesses now distinguishable from people working from home? Will these added units become commercial businesses in disguise? So in terms of, it's an interesting question. In terms of how they're distinguishable from, what's the difference between home business and someone with an office job that works from home? Ultimately, you can't know, unless you're peeking inside and asking a bunch of questions. We do have a zoning, or we do have a bylaw around the registration and licensing of home businesses. You're allowed to have a home business. There are a lot of restrictions on it. Restrictions on signage, restrictions on, basically your business can't be the type of business where you're getting a lot of foot traffic. So like, for instance, I don't think that you could put a dentist office in your house because you're going to have people coming in and out. It really is meant to be, you know, you're an accountant or something and you work out of a home office or something like that. Now, the line between that and someone who has a downtown job and they work from home, it becomes a little blurrier in the world we live in right now. This is an issue that, is kind of, really about enforcement. If there's a suspicion that someone's operating a home business that's having some type of negative impact on the neighborhood, that's an issue for the building commissioner to enforce. But ultimately, we are dealing with the changing world here. And I think, one of the things is a lot more people are working from home and, you've got to ask, what is the difference between a home business and working from home? So it's actually a really interesting question. I'm not going to continue to ramble on it, but it's going to be something I'll be thinking about. Another question from Donna Dickerson in the Q&A. Why not create new sub-districts 8, 9, 10, and so on? I think that, we can certainly kind of take a look at, perhaps bringing back some of those portions of the transit area that, we had removed for kind of lot size purposes. But I think ultimately, for every piece of physical geography that you bring back into the transit area, you need to be looking at what is the unit capacity that geography is bringing with it. And is it increasing our overall units per acre, or is it decreasing our overall units per acre? And if it's decreasing it, then that means that you need to commensurately increase the number of units on a lot, either in the transit area or somewhere else. And so it becomes a really delicate balance between, how much physical geography do we include in these districts versus how many units are they actually giving us? Because the problem that we're having now is the overall district is not dense enough. And you can do that by cranking up the numerator in terms of, increasing density in the unit capacity, or you can adjust that by decreasing the denominator, which means taking physical geography and acreage out of the equation. So those are two different variables that we can modulate. We can certainly take a look and see if adding additional smaller sub-districts to the transit area helps. But our experience has been that's not the case, but we can continue to look at it. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. How much of the land proposed for MBTA zoning is currently undeveloped / natural habitat? Seems like we should prioritize trying to preserve what little natural habitat remains in town. Again, very good question. I would dispute a little bit, the idea of preserving what little natural habitat remains in town. Milton has an extraordinary amount of natural habitat, between the Deposit River Reservation, the Blue Hills, all of the conservation land that we have in town. We are very lucky to have the amount of conservation land and the amount of natural habitat that we have. Now, obviously, you want to be very careful about, we're talking about kind of publicly owned, publicly managed, in a public trust land. There's also a lot of private land that is, a natural habitat, but is someone's private property that they could redevelop, for instance, under our subdivision rules at any time they want. So the balancing act between, regulating people's private open space and also allowing them to have the property rights that they have under zoning is a really delicate one. So I guess what I'll say to answer that question, and we'll kind of go to, the broader map over here, is, if you look at, Fuller Village, for instance, this Brush Hill Road subdistrict, that was created via special permit to, allow for significant amounts of open space. And so if we were to create a zoning district down here, we would want to do our best to recreate that. And you can do that in a lot of ways. You can have a minimum open space requirement. You can have a maximum lot coverage requirement, that allows you to preserve that open space. So basically saying like, if you've got to have 60, 70, 80% of your site needs to be, preserved as open space in order to build. Now, the trade-off for that is we need units through the zoning. That's what it's all about. And there are kind of two ways that you can increase the number of units. One is to increase them horizontally, which means, single family houses or 1 or 2 story buildings horizontally across the land, which means you're digging up trees, you're digging up grass, you're digging up habitat, or you can spread out vertically, which means building height. So, there's a concept in planning called floor area ratio, which is basically a ratio of the floor area of a building to the area of a lot. And if you think of a parcel that has a floor area ratio of 1, that means that the floor area of the building is equal to the area of the lot. So it's lot line to lot line in a 1-story building. In a 2-story building, it's now on half the parcel, because you've got 2 stories that are comprising the entire area of the building, and then it's only on half of the parcel. And then the taller you get, the more of the parcel is now opened up and not built upon. So, this becomes really important when we're talking about multifamily development, in the sense of, there's 2 ways to think about it. If you're out here, in the woods, for lack of a better term, you want to be building as little building footprint as possible, because the bigger your building footprint, the more trees you're ripping up, the more habitat you're tearing up. But in order to reduce the building footprint and get the number of units you need, the buildings have to be taller. And people don't like tall buildings, but that's the trade-off for preserving that open space. The other way to think about it is, in the transit area and kind of, on either end, at Unquity House, in Milton Village, Central Ave, in East Milton, these are already developed areas. There was natural habitat in Lower Mills at some point. It hasn't been there for a long time. And there's an argument to be made that we should be intensifying development in places where development already exists. It has a lot of benefits. You're not tearing up new habitat. You're taking advantage of existing infrastructure in terms of roads and pipes and sidewalks and amenities and everything else. But, the consequence is these areas are already built up. There's a thing I like to say, I don't know if people like it when I say it, but, we don't have a lot of land, but we've got plenty of sky, right? And so if you want to intensify land use in an area that's already built up, you've got to build up. And, that means height. And again, some people aren't comfortable with height, but the trade-off is now we're not building as much in areas that are kind of pristine, untouched, habitat. And so, that's something, it's definitely a part of the calculation in terms of what we're doing here. I'm just reading the question. I don't actually know the figure of how much of these are kind of untouched kind of, habitat, but you can kind of look at it on a map and kind of judge for yourself. We've got a question from an anonymous attendee. If we permit new build outside of the transit district and all the folks who live in the new housing need to drive to the transit district to get on the Mattapan trolley, where will they all park their cars? That's a fine question. And, where will they park their cars? I don't know. We have regulated parking in the business districts, Central Ave, Milton Village. The longest parking period is 2 hours. That's been more vigorously enforced recently than it has been in the past. And the thinking being there is that the parking is meant to serve the business district, so that, people can go in and out to the stores and not have to worry about finding a parking space, because a T commuter is kind of leaving their car there all day. In the neighborhoods adjacent to Valley Road and Capon Street, you also see, some signage, on the corners near those stations that say, 2-hour parking. I don't know how well that gets enforced, hopefully just as much as everywhere else. But that becomes an enforcement issue. I think, when you're talking about development in sort of more outlying areas, you do have to take into account that the further you get from transit, the more auto-oriented a development is. And so there wouldn't necessarily be an assumption that someone is dropping their car off at the trolley and then taking the trolley in. The assumption is, once you're in your car and you're on 28, you're in your car and you're on 28 until you get downtown or wherever it is you're going. So that becomes, a question to ask is like, do we want that? Is that something that, you want to have in your town of encouraging people to drive? It's an argument for concentrating development in the transit area. But again, there are other considerations there in terms of, how much of a burden do we want to put on the transit area in terms of new development? My thinking here on issues like this is, you don't want to be in the business of, paying a parking ticket every day. Although, if that's cheaper than parking downtown, maybe you need to think about your parking ticket rates. I don't know. It's a good question, but I think that, the further you get out, the more you're going to find folks are just driving, and they're not necessarily driving to transit, because again, it's taken you that long to get up to Mattapan Station or Milton Station already. You're already halfway there, if not closer. So, good question. We've got another one from Kathleen O'Donnell in the Q&A. Isn't there a process that allows the town to send HLC a preliminary map of districts to see what will work? And why wouldn't we ask if East Milton and Granite Ave work? We have the tool that the state is going to use to make these judgments, and we are able to, in a relatively rapid fire manner, test these scenarios and test these districts to see, if they'll yield compliance. The state's process is longer, and frankly is kind of, I think, designed to be a sort of pre-town meeting test, just to sort of, the final kind of revision, before you get to town meeting. I think that, if we were going to send something to HLC for their opinion, we'd want it to be a little bit more baked than what we have right now. So I think there's still a little bit of homework for us to do, but I do definitely think that we'll be availing ourselves of the opportunity to get a sort of a pre-clearance from HLC once we have some sub-districts that we think will work. I don't see any more hands or any more questions in the Q&A, and we are at 9 p.m. on the nosy. So I'd love to be able to wrap it up in 2 hours. So I want to thank everybody for coming. I think these were really, really great questions. We walk out of these forums really taking to heart the questions and the comments that we get. We definitely are kind of working and operating out of what we believe are the best, planning best practices. But it really does pay to hear from people, that are out there living this stuff in the neighborhoods. So we definitely want to continue to do these things. I want you to continue to write us, continue to come to these forums. We're going to do our best to incorporate your feedback. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.